Right, without further ado, I'd like to invite the finalists to start the debate.
Start. Ladies and gentlemen, the problem in status quo today is that even though you're born, say, a woman or a man, traits associated with feminism or traits associated with masculinity are man-created. They have nothing to do with what you are as an individual. They have nothing to do with who you are born as an individual or who you become eventually. But what they essentially do is that they essentially restrict your ability to exercise your potential out there and essentially maximize all the benefits you can gain from your life on Earth. And that's something that we would like to correct on side government by implementing this mandate, making it compulsory that no institution whatsoever uses gender as a base of distinction, uses gender as any means of segregation, which means that up to the age of 16 or 18, based on the legal age of consent in countries all across the globe, you would be considered genderless or just simply human child before you consent to being either a man, woman, or something else for that matter. So what are we trying to achieve through side government's policy? We're trying to achieve two things, right? The first thing that we're trying to achieve is to increase the ability of an individual to self-actualize, the ability of an individual or the ability of that individual to maximize their potential in achieving whatsoever that they can essentially achieve in their life. Second, we're trying to uplift the LGBT community. We're trying to help the LGBT community through our policy because we believe that by making genderless children or by essentially implementing this policy, there will be a much different way at which the LGBT community is viewed in society. But before I go on, yes.
Will you prosecute parents and remove children from houses that refuse to follow your policy?
In the case of parents who refuse to follow policy, we'll obviously first start out with say 1 or 2 warnings, before which we will take away their children from them in the case where they continue to sit down. In the case where they continue to use gender as a means of raising their children, in the case where they continuously identify or essentially grow their child as a boy or a girl. So now let's first understand what goes on in status quo before we essentially move on to what side government is trying to achieve, right? Because even though we see that there is gaining traction for the feminist movement, where we believe that women are allowed to do all that men can essentially do, and at the same time men are allowed to be more feminine, as they say, in their ability to self-actualize today, ladies and gentlemen, large populations on planet Earth still experience that form of discrimination or stereotypes in the case where they go away from the norm. So we believe that when such gender identities exist and they're so inconcrete today in status quo, it's difficult to uplift women or to uplift individuals who want to go away from the norm, give them the chance to self-actualize. Because even if you have crusaders, even if you have stories of success, you have equal or more number of stories where people are forbidden from doing what they want to do. That's why you have billions of women staying in the household, looking after their children, and essentially making sure that the household chores are attended to. Similarly, billions of men across the world are expected to work every day because they are expected to be the primary breadwinner of the family. So you often see one man supporting a family of 6 to 7 people and essentially going through the grind, and that essentially results in the vicious cycle of poverty, that essentially results in a lot of economic downturns that exist under status quo. And that's why we believe that under the present identities of gender which exist, we cannot fully maximize the potential, or cannot essentially do so in good enough time to help all people around the world, and in doing so help the global community in itself. So let's first talk about how we essentially enable individuals to self-actualize to the maximum possible limit, right? So what do we essentially do? We essentially ban schools from essentially distinguishing between boys and girls. We no longer have gender-specific schools. You can't have an all-boys school or an all-girls school. You have all your seminars or all your lectures are dedicated to saying what an individual can achieve, or what an individual is expected to do, which is basically make sure that they make a life for themselves. They stay as happy as possible in whatever they're doing. Of course, if it's not legal. But in that case, we essentially from a very young age instill in the child that they no longer are restricted by the boundaries of gender. They no longer have to do what a woman is expected to do or what a man is expected to do, for that matter. even sexuality for that matter is now left to the discretion of that individual, right? Because you no longer associate a man loving a woman or a woman loving a man, because you are after all genderless. So if I'm a boy, say by my sexual organs attracted towards say another boy for that matter, then in that case, because under a present status quo, we essentially associate women loving men and men loving women at the particular age where I can grant consent, I can choose to be a woman for that matter, ladies and gentlemen. And so I believe that such gender norms or such attributes that are associated to gender should be left to choice, right? And this is something that the government in itself promises. How does it do so, right? Because you have something called the right to equality, the right to expression of speech in its entirety. But is that a right that exists in a spectrum, ladies and gentlemen? We believe not, right? Because it sounds really great on paper to say that an individual should be able to do everything that an individual can without affecting another individual. But when you're brought up in a stereotype, when you're told that this is what a woman can possibly do to the extent of achieving a good family, of raising good children, and that woman is limited in her potential of doing so, then comes the question, well, what about the parents, right? Because they still do exist. What about the fact that they still probably will instill that form of patriarchy or that form of gender stereotypes that exist? But you need to understand that state laws essentially dictate the kind of culture or the kind of community that you essentially have. For example, a few years ago, corporally punishing children in households was completely fine, was an accepted norm. But that changed, right? Because after laws were enacted to make sure that children cannot be corporally punished, parents themselves cannot raise a finger on the children, that became an accepted norm to begin with. And the difference is that these children are still in their households, but the only difference is that they are now probably being looked upon as humans in their classrooms, where they spend most amount of time interacting with people called humans, not girls and boys in their classrooms, which essentially make sure that they aren't binded by the gender norms that exist. Second, we believe that by doing so, we essentially increase the potential of a nation to be economically successful, right? Because we believe that nations lose billions of dollars by placing limits on genders, right? So when women are told that you're supposed to stay in the household, you're essentially cutting down a tap of extreme potential of probably lawyers or probably engineers who essentially enter the society, who can do great in terms of the economy, who can pay taxes, who can essentially make sure the nation is doing really well for itself. So we believe that by essentially enabling every individual to self-actualize to the maximum possible limit, the nation in itself benefits, because individuals are doing what they like, are doing what they're best at, ladies and gentlemen, and therefore are doing great for that nation. For all those above reasons, I'm very proud to propose. Thank you.
Right, with that, I'd like to invite the leader of opposition.
Mr. Speaker, they tried to make this debate seem as though all children in this world are so very confused about their gender and they're put in such a tough spot just because they have to grow up as a boy or as a girl, right? We don't think that this is the true picture. So what I'm going to do for you is I'm going to characterize this debate to show you what status quo really is today and how it's not so bad and we can fix it if there really is such a big problem, but their solution is not the way to go, right? Because they tried to tell you that, you know, imposing this genderless concept is going to remove all sorts of gender norms and gender roles, but we don't think that's the case. Why? If a genderless male decides to, at the age of consent, decides to be, if a genderless person decides to identify as a male at the age of consent, he will then still have to conform to what a male does and all those things, because he could only ever be genderless when he was a child, right? So we don't think that this is a proper solution for the problems that they tried to tell you was in this debate today. They tried to tell you that their goals were to increase self-actualization and to improve acceptance of the LGBT community. That we think that's far too reaching and they will never be able to discharge those burdens, right? Because we think that we think that as a child in such a confusing world, we think that it's necessary for you to have some sort of outline. Sit down. some sort of stability and security and comfort in order to explore within those outlines. We think that the current status quo of being a boy or being a girl, which is dictated by your biological features, is fine, right? We think that most children actually fall within those outlines. But for the few minority that fall out of, we still think status quo is okay, because at the age of consent, you still have the opportunity and the chance to change your gender if you so feel that you're not comfortable with what you've been growing up as all these years, right? So we think that the ability to self-actualize is very much still there, but instead of increasing it under their paradigm, you're actually taking it away from the majority of children, because you're introducing such a confusing element, which is something that my second speaker is going to elaborate further. Closing.
Where would it be easier for one to change their religion, if one was raised Muslim or if one was raised agnostic?
We think that when you're raised agnostic, then you can still do it, but we think that it's easier. We think that, it's two different debates, right? We're talking about gender today, and it's something that is dictated by nature, and you have innate biological features which you can change, but most people are comfortable with living the way that they are. So we think that instead of introducing such a drastic change to status quo, you can just focus on fixing it, which is what we see today, right? We think that there are an erosion of gender roles and gender norms. We are fine with that, with the speed of that progression. We think that we are going somewhere with this, and we don't think that your solution is going to actually solve anything. Sit down. So what am I going to talk to you about today, right? I'm going to tell you how this actually is within the parental rights of the parent, and how we should retain this liberty of the parents in order to do this, since they are the guardian of the child, right? And Hanan's going to talk to you about how this is very confusing and introduces a lot of harms to these children that they're trying to help, right? So we think that, an example, Shiloh doesn't identify with being a girl, right? That's pretty obvious in mass media. She wants to dress as a boy, she wants to wear tuxedos, and we think that's fine, there's no problem with that. Neither do Angelina Jolie and Brad Pitt. Do they see any problem with that, right? We think that when your child doesn't identify with the gender they're given, as a parent, you do have an option to raise your child whichever way your child sees fit. We think that does happen in status quo, and we think those children are fine, right? Under the government's paradigm, children like Shiloh will actually be harmed because they're forced to wear girls' clothes as well as boys' clothes under the label of genderless, and we think that that's not something they will necessarily be comfortable with. But apart from that, in addition to the harm that Shiloh faces, now Max and all the other children will also face certain harms because they're being put in this uncomfortable position, right? We think that that's bad. Instead of empowering the choice of a certain small community, certain small section of children, right? You're actually taking away the full options of all the children. So we don't think that's a good thing.
Second POI.
Sure.
In a developing country, if a mere child were to come to his parents and say that I want to be a fashion designer, mom or dad, what do you think is going to be the reaction of that particular parent?
We think the idea of that child being raised as a boy or a girl or genderless does not affect what he wants to be when he grows up at all, right? And we don't think that it's fair for you to corner this debate into a developing country and a guy and a son who wants to become a fashion designer. We think that's very selective of you. We don't think that's actually reflective of the way status quo works, right? But then they also told you that, this is really important for the economic potential of the country, because right now our labor force is so gender segregated based on gender, right? We question you, what century are you living in? Do you think that, it's quite clear that today we already see a number of women in STEM career roles, or like engineers or those sort of things, right? We think status quo is doing just fine in trying to eradicate the gender norms that follow you into your working life. We don't see a problem with how that's going on, right? And also, we don't see how this proposal is going to solve that even more. We don't think that being genderless is so crucial in you being able to follow through with what you're really interested in doing in your life, right? So basically, the problem with their case today is that they tried to take on burdens that were way too big for them to handle and to ever discharge, right? But But on the other side, it's also their problems with what they would do to people who disobey these arbitrary rules that they placed on society. First, they're going to warn the parents, but they never told us what extent to which they were willing to enforce these rules, right? They even told you that they would have to ban distinction in schools and those sort of things, but they never told you the impact of these policies. We think it will be very harmful for children because you're introducing something so new, and we don't think that right now within this society we have the necessity to do this sort of thing, because as I've said, status quo is moving towards a gender neutral but not necessarily a genderless society, right? So basically, what have I told you today? I've told you that because parents are close to their children, they are able to basically I've told you that this policy is unnecessary. Status quo is doing just fine, and they need to really discharge the burdens they're pushing forward. Because of that, thank you.
We find it problematic that Hillary Clinton's campaign is basically vote for a woman, because no woman has become a president yet in America. This is an exact depiction of what gender roles essentially do to individuals. Because young girls from young age aren't told, hey, you know what? You can do everything that you essentially want to do, anything that you possibly want to. And even if they're told that, right, they essentially see the society, they essentially see how the world works, where women are essentially asked or expected to do certain things, whereas men are expected to do certain other things, ladies and gentlemen. So even if you are born in a liberal household, the one that side opposition wants to make this debate about, where parents are completely fine with what a child essentially wants to do or achieve, the child in itself is growing in an environment where the society in itself tells the child that this is essentially your role in society because you belong to a particular gender, right? And that is intrinsically harmful, because the child, even if the child doesn't express the fact that he or she or whatever wants to do something or the other, they kill the very aspect or the ability in themselves of doing so, because they believe that that's not what's expected of them, that's not that they can achieve in society, ladies and gentlemen. And that's something that we change through our policy, right? So what do we do? What do we essentially do? They clearly pointed out how there are celebrities who essentially dress gender neutral, or transgenders who are really famous, who believe that they are man stuck in a woman's body or vice versa. But we believe that by essentially exercising this particular policy, we give that opportunity of that child to not be ridiculized from very young age, to not be forced into accepting his or her sexuality, or even more, even doing certain character traits which are associated with certain genders, right? It can extend on a spectrum. On one side, it can go as far as choosing one's own sexuality and not being ridiculized for doing so. And on the other hand, it can be about choosing something as simple as a career goal in a developing country or in a conservative society where we believe that certain careers are meant only for women or certain careers are meant only for men, ladies and gentlemen. And so we believe that we solve this problem throughout that particular spectrum, because we do two things, right? One, we tell the society that you cannot essentially identify children as a particular gender. And second, we essentially we don't give these children a world where gender roles exist or specific roles in society exist for them in the first place, right? Because if I've been born and brought up from day one in a school or an institution or around people who are not identified as men or women, who aren't identified as individuals who are expected to do certain things, right? Then I can broaden my horizons. I can think of doing things that I possibly wouldn't do in the case where I was a man or a woman. That's why my POI about, say, a boy, say, in a conservative society going up to his parents and saying that, Mom, Dad, I want to be a fashion designer, is probably going to be shunted down or be told that, hey, listen, you're a boy. Boys aren't expected to go into the fashion industry. Boys aren't expected to take up careers in that particular line. You're possibly going to be a doctor or an engineer, right? So in that, we agree that parents will exist even in our policy who will possibly say that very thing. But the difference is that now the child has a bargaining chip. The child sees a world where individuals essentially aren't limited by their particular gender roles, aren't limited by their genders, right? So one, children will first have the courage of actually going out and telling their parents or telling the world that they want to do a particular thing, even though it's not expected of them or even though society says otherwise. Second, parents themselves will change gradually, right? Because this policy obviously is not something that works overnight. It's something that will work gradually because you are being brought up in an environment where all children are genderless. It's not like a particular part of the population embraces it. You're forced to embrace it on all areas of the spectrum. So gradually, parents too will essentially imbibe into this particular policy. And second, if you're raising children or you're making it compulsory to raise children in a genderless society, then in that case, the next generation, the children that these genderless children in itself will raise will be more accepting of raising their children in a genderless society to begin with. I'm sure opposition is going to come here and bitch about how we possibly don't have a policy about taking away children for that matter. Ladies and gentlemen, that's completely in line with status quo. If you corporally punish your children under status quo, your children will be taken away from you. You will be given jail time for that matter. So it's the same thing. If you restrict your child's ability of choosing what he or she wants to do, of choosing something as basic as their sexuality, ladies and gentlemen, we believe that the harms are as significant as that of corporal punishment. And so we believe that it's completely fine of taking these children away from parents because we want to be in line with the state's idea of giving complete equality and ensuring that equality exists in the first place, ladies and gentlemen. So now they came here and bitched about how parents have the right to essentially choose what their children should do, or children in itself are confused. Ladies and gentlemen, when does confusion arise? It's when you want to do something, but society or your parents tell you that, no, this is not what you're exactly supposed to do. So when a boy essentially develops feelings for other boys, he questions himself. He probably thinks about how he'll probably be discriminated against or probably justified against by other children in school, because other children in school believe that girls should like boys and boys should like girls for that matter. But under our policy, when we believe that children are brought up in a genderless society where that notion of how a man should love a woman or a woman should love a man doesn't exist. You don't have films or you don't have other sorts of mainstream media, textbooks for that matter. Sit down. Placing that objection on how a man should solely essentially love another woman or vice versa, ladies and gentlemen. And so we believe that we have the LGBT community, but before sex, yeah, go on.
So is it a position of opening government that you would remove gender or any identification from a child's life, i.e. parents, the school and everything else this child is associated with?
Sure. And in terms of even mainstream media, any child below the age of 16 or 18 who is an actor in the film also should be portrayed as genderless for that matter. We are completely okay with also placing restrictions on such forms of mainstream media. And this idea of confusion doesn't exist, right? Because you're essentially placed with a platter of opportunities, a platter of exploring yourself, and you get to choose which one you associate with the most. Confusion arises when you want something and that something isn't brought to you in the first place, ladies and gentlemen. And they cannot come here and tell us that the world is changing. Well, even if it is, it's changing in way too slow a pace, ladies and gentlemen, a pace that we don't consent with. And so we believe that our policy essentially fastens that process of making sure that that gender neutral, the ideal version of the gender neutral society actually exists, where you're not limited by your gender in the first place, ladies and gentlemen. And so for all those above reasons, I'm very, very proud to propose. Finally, parents should not be given the right to choose what their children want, ladies and gentlemen, because in that case, every parent already has a stereotypical version of what their child should be. A child should be what the child wants to be, ladies and gentlemen. And to essentially give that child a full maximization of his potential or her potential, go with side proposition. Thank you.
That election right
Mr. Speaker, under their side, they aim to dismantle gender stereotype. They want to create they want to focus on self-actualization and maximize potentials. And they also talk about how there's no confusions under our side, how there's no confusion under their side, and also that expectations is not even important. Parental expectation will go away. They want to create a world where everyone is genderless. We don't think that's possible. Okay, there are 3 issues I'm going to talk about on their side, and I'm going to talk to you about how that a genderless society creates a lot of confusions and how it is harmful. First thing first, let's deal with the point on gender stereotype, right? They talk about how by having genderless society, automatically all the activities and all the roles out there will be gender neutral all by itself. But we think that under their side, what's going to happen is that the people will go genderless, but all those roles are still acknowledged to certain genders only. How so? First, under their side, they're not dismantling gender stereotype, but they create another group that can enjoy gender neutral roles. How? People, for instance, a genderless person, if he were to opt into being a man, then he still have to stick to male gender roles once he become a man. Why so? Because under their side, only genderless category people can actually enjoy gender neutral roles and gender neutral activities. And we believe that under our side, not everyone wants to remain genderless to enjoy the benefit of gender neutral roles, assuming that their side will be successful in doing that. So it is another form of coercion. And this creates another problem under our side as well. So, and secondly, they talk about how they will maximize self-actualization and potentials. We don't think that's possible. Why so? Because we believe that gender stereotypes can still exist on their side. For instance, if the parents dress their child with boys' clothes and dress their child and give their child male toys or encourage them to join male activities, what would the state say? The state will say, oh, you're not raising your child in the genderless way. You're raising your child to be a guy, to be a boy. It means that the state still acknowledge that those kind of activities, those kind of toys are still belong to the group of male. So it means that you are not dismantling gender stereotype. You're just creating another group of genderless people that can enjoy that can enjoy both roles coming from female and males. After their age of consent, when they choose to be a man or a female, whichever that they relate the most, they still have to go through the problems of gender stereotypes. They still have to stick with their gender stereotypes and so on. So we think that is harmful and it doesn't create self-actualization or maximizing anyone's potentials at all because they are forced to remain genderless to enjoy their benefits. So we think that they are ridiculous. Secondly, they talk about how there will be no confusion. He himself acknowledge the fact that there are many things that the children have to explore, right? The fact that there are too many things, plethora of choices that they have to make, makes them confused. And secondly, they say that the children cannot opt out they say that the children are confused because they are being forced to follow a certain strict they are being forced to adhere to a certain strict roles, right? We don't think that it's perpetual. The children can actually opt out from their gender. That's why there are a lot of people opening up about their gender preferences and so on. There are a lot of sex change operations are more accessible nowadays, and a lot of celebrities tell the public that it's fine to be a female when you were born male when your parents pick your gender, right? So we think that its status quo is already fine. However, under our side, at least when they have all those choice, which is when they have all those certain outlines, certain things that they're expected to do, it makes them feel more comforting. We're not saying that under our side boys cannot try out what girls do. We believe that under our side we are progressive enough to allow those boys, those people who identify themselves as boys, to try out girls' activities, and that is how you dismantle gender stereotype in the first place. So we've told you that how we need those kind of outlines, right? And we believe that the majority of people fall within that outline, within that category. So having to opt to being genderless means that the parents are forced to raise the children both ways. So children at the young age who are already can relate themselves to certain genders are forced to act like the other gender that they're not comfortable with. In comparison to our side, where we strive to dismantle stereotypes by making activities and roles gender neutral, even if you're born a boy, even if you're born a girl, even if you are a girl or a boy on your birth certificate or something, you can try out both roles because you don't have to stick to that. And then, yes.
Which side do you think choice is maximized most? Where there's gender-based advertising, where there's a girls section and a boys section in every clothes rack, or where there's simply a genderless section where you are allowed to choose what looks good on you?
Choices exist on our side more. Why so? Because under our side, if your parents already pick you as a boy and you're progressive enough to allow boys to do girls activities, then sure they can do it. And also under our side, people who are already identified with male gender, right? Their parents don't have to force them to try out female activities just to raise them genderlessly. And so more options on our side. And people who are already being picked as a male and doesn't want to be a female, you can always opt out from your gender. There's no problem on that. A lot of people have done that nowadays, and we want to encourage that instead of creating another subgroup of genderless. We want to acknowledge them being unable to relate to their gender and change their gender. And secondly, the minority. We say that under our side, only a certain minority, right, that doesn't fall into the outline that the parents have already given, the expectation that their parents have already given. So, and they cannot relate to the gender that their parents pick. So what happened in our status quo? There are sex change operations that are getting more and more accessible. There are a lot of feminist movements and LGBT movements that actually actually encourage them to change their gender if they want to. There are a lot of people opening up nowadays, but like what I've told just now. So it means that this minority also have a lot of solutions to get out of their options. And at the same time, we do not antagonize the majority, and the majority can still have their options to live their life without being genderless at that very young age, where they're so confused. And with that, I rest my case. Thank you.
Yeah, like invite member of the
Let's clarify a few things first. This debate is not about whether or not parents can dictate a particular gender, but rather which role would be more preferable. Like from the onset, to be ingrained in children's minds that they are born genderless, may it be legally or may it be through social implications. What goes on in the household, as long as it's not abusive, we're perfectly fine with, right? But let's go at the heart of it, because this debate aims to analyze where do people access more freedoms, where do we free ourselves from the human condition, because I think that both opening teams agreed that it's good if people can decide, but what both teams failed to answer, in which paradigm would people be able to decide? What are the factors that make these choices accessible and applicable? Because coming from opening opposition, all they claimed was, we're not banning you from wearing a dress, therefore all is fine and swell in the world. But we think that people, in their own sense of being people, prevent themselves from accessing these realities. Though it is possible for women to become CEOs, if you look at the number, women are not, well, as often CEOs as compared to men. Right? So first, given that I already explained the preferable world thing, fiat, let's move on to the new generation, right? Because basically this starts from zero, like when people are born, which will be more preferable, how do we identify it? Since PM never really told us how that happens, we think these two things happen either legally or socially. The word identified would mean on all of your legal documents, it will say genderless. Socially, we're gonna use it in schools, in public play areas, maybe even a nod to Sweden and Germany, wherein there is no pronoun for boy or girl, but rather in schools, in public schools now, they use the term hen in Sweden, right? Meaning that we don't segregate really. So we're going to socially construct that as well. Everything in our policies will be aligned. Great. Public play areas will not have pink or blue things. After that. So let's respond to the whole elephant in the room thing about parents and why it's still okay, why will our policy still be effective even if parents say that you're a boy. The big assumption that people make here is that people cannot compartmentalize themselves, right? Children compartmentalize themselves all the time. They can be a bully in the schoolyard, but mommy's little boy at home. Meaning that even if parents say, you are a boy, act manly, act masculinely, right? Outside, in a genderless environment where you're referred to as hen, where you're constantly like encouraged by your teachers to try things like cooking or being a stewardess, we think that these things can also be normalized in children. Normalization does not just happen at home, which is why we're okay if parents say that you are a boy or you are a girl, but we will not criminalize them, right? So it's just as effective, and normalization can happen outside also, which is why we can be rebels outside and still be adult rebels, even though at home we are angels. Cool. Moving on, I'll take a point before I move on.
If normalization works in this world, why is it true that Muslim people or Muslim children are less likely to associate themselves with other races in like schools, for example?
Because they're raised in a homogeneous environment. Most likely, if you have a Muslim being raised in France, wherein outside they may not be allowed to wear their headscarf, or where they're forced to socialize on a level where people come from different cultural backgrounds, these people may be a bit more, well, open to ideas as compared to a homogeneous environment where you are Islamized inside the household and in your schools and public areas. We're talking about level of exposure and level of comfort here, which is what I will argue, right? So far, from government, you have not heard, well, we've heard that it's good. You've heard that it's good that people be open to things, but what's really stopping us from accessing what we can and what we can be as people? Sadly, we are victims of the human condition, right? Policies can be as aggressive as they can. We can have as many STEM open courses for women, but the problem is, and think about it, why do we have to subsidize for women to enter these courses? Why do we have to heavily bait them into something that we say is their legal right to do so? The problem and the heart of it is because people don't want to do it themselves. Why? We think that the internal fear that people feel, the guilt that they feel because of the normalized environment that they are currently subject to, prevents them from accessing these things, which is why in my point earlier to leader of OP, I asked her, is it easier to choose a religion at the age of majority when you were raised Muslim or when you were raised in a non-specific household, probably one that's agnostic? Because we think that as long as you are normalized and it's concretely told you that this is your identity and what's outside of normal is bad, these individuals will most likely not even try to do it. What's the diagnosis, right? Because we think people form their own cages. As children, we are born learning from social cues. Like our first words are based on how, like the words that we hear from our parents, which is why most children, their first word is mom or dad, right? The thing is that
On that point,
we learn from normalization. Whatever we see on a daily basis, whatever we're born into is something that we're comfortable with. And this is the exact same age where you grow your comfort zones and where you grow anxieties. Whatever is outside that is something that brings guilt towards individual. The subconscious controls us more than we think, right? I'll take you after this argument. We think the subconscious controls you and it also controls your stress level, how comfortable you are entering a few new decisions, right? And anything outside that will give you guilt. The problem is, how do we really eradicate guilt? So right now, we're trying to pay women with subsidies, trying to get them out of the guilt of not being feminine enough or not being housewives, for example. And we think that this guilt can only be changed through the environment we raise children in, which is why Germany decided to remove the classification of gender in official documents as well as in public schools. But we think that comparatively, where would you have a better world for the future generation? Because if you look at our paradigm, that these children will not develop that guilt to begin with, that these children will be raised in a more open environment where they are free to try things. But before that, I promise you a point.
Is an unfulfilled happiness because of this guilt your parents will end up doing anyway preferable than coerced happiness because we enforce a gender on them?
coerced happiness. I don't really see how coerced happiness can happen, because happiness depends on how comfortable you feel as a person and the kind of environment you're raised. And the more open it is, the more open you will be when you grow up, right? So it all describes in the description of what is normal. Is it normal for you to try what is not well subscribed to you? And we think that the only reason we can remove that is to remove the pre-prescribed prescription to begin with. How does that happen, right? Legally. We give the children reassurance that when they look at their document, no one can tell me what I am. And we think that's something very reassuring for future generations. And like, for example, we tell them that they are free to choose whatever they can be. It's the same as living in a world where people, like now, don't have professions when they are born. Right? Why? Because we find it highly restrictive. Like, for example, we see that children born in an agricultural household where their parents tell them they will be farmers and poor in the future is a less freeing environment than where governments open up the opportunity to tell children that they can be whatever they can be. This is the exact same thing that we are applying towards the realm of gender, and we think that people are freer to choose. It's a world we'd rather live in. Thanks.
I'd like to invite the member of the debate.
Yeah.
Yeah, cool. I am most happy at home. And to an extent, the values that my parents have instilled upon me carry forward to how I perceive society and the public sphere. This idea that closing government has brought you on normalization, and how even if in the home sphere, parents indoctrinate their children with the gender values, when they go out into the public sphere, suddenly these values will disappear. But before I go into their case and specifically, I'm just going to outline my rebuttals firstly. So I have 4 questions in my rebuttals. Number 1, who gets better treatment for gender norms? Number 2, who protects the LGBTQIA community? This is all for OG. And thirdly, why children will never have a bargaining chip against their parents. And to address closing government, just like this idea of why normalization won't happen. So firstly, who gets better treatment for gender norms? Firstly, there was this very vague characterization on what punishments you would instill upon parents. So you would say that they would get a warning, a very soft stance, soft punishment warning, and then perhaps after the 3rd or 4th warning, like a drug offense, you would remove children. But up until that point where you're forced to remove the child from the parent's home, we think that number 1, these children are still forced to accept a certain amount of gender identity, because at all this time, these parents are able to indoctrinate their children. But number 2, we think that the government is a far worse caretaker for children. And that's why we think that bad parenting and foster homes are a lot better than, say, government protection, because governments don't have a maternal or paternal care, and they simply cannot fill that void under any circumstance. But also on this idea that governments are horrible policing of moral values. It's not just that they shouldn't, but it's really literally that they can't, because morals are so subjective. Different people have different ideas, and that's why we would champion have a seat, a non-secular state where governments don't dictate a particular religion for their people. So the same would extend to gender norms. Have a seat, because this idea of gender norms on who and who should we provide more from, those that are genderless, girls or boys, these are questions that should not and cannot be addressed by the government. So the same extends, thank you for agreeing with me, government. So the same, have a seat. So the same extends to protection for LGBTQIA communities, because for the first time, governments that have oppressed the LGBTQIA and have ignored them for centuries suddenly want to protect them. It also doesn't make sense, because government doesn't set the standard for how LGBTQIA people can self-actualize and come to champion their identities. Have a seat. But lastly, for opening government, why children will never have a bargaining chip against their parents, because this is simply not true. My parents control my home, my food, my schooling, literally every aspect of my life. This extends to religion. Parents can dictate which religions their children will follow, and as an extension, they have the choice to choose their child's identity. Have a seat. We don't see a distinction between parents deciding religion and parents deciding identity, a gender, because both of these can be aspects for which people can champion their own identities. So I can identify as a Christian or as a Muslim. Likewise, I can identify as a girl or a boy. Have a seat. Because this is something that was frankly quite confusing, because opening government decided to restrict a child's ability to take ownership of their gender, but they missed the debate because they simply cannot choose. By forcing genderlessness upon them, you take the decision out of their hands because they can't behave like a girl or behave like a boy, have a seat, because the societal norm is that they're neither of these things. And this is extremely harmful for a number of reasons, and this clashes directly with my case. But before I go to closing government share, I'll take opening.
Okay, so as a child, say a boy loves playing with Barbie dolls, yet his parents tell him that that's the wrong thing to do because boys are supposed to play with commandos or guns. In a world where no toys are advertised specifically to girls and boys, and it's in that world where the child gets to set that and choose what he or she, or for that matter, the genderless child wants to do.
But in your sphere, you wouldn't have things like Barbie dolls, which are seen as effeminate caricatures. You wouldn't have such things existing. You'd probably have things in green or purple, which is a mixture of pink and blue. So these stores just wouldn't exist in your paradigm. Have a seat. Because Barbie boy wouldn't exist, because children boys wouldn't exist under your paradigm. So on this idea of closing government and normalization won't happen because it's parents that make the difference who you are at home. This is reflective of who you are publicly. And there are two scenarios to this. Number one, maybe you at home, your parents force you to be a girl and you go to school and you champion yourself as a girl, but the rest of your peers are genderless. So you're ostracized in school. Those that are genderless hate you because you go against the norm. But the second is that you go with the flow, you become genderless like the rest of your peers, but you know at home, in your true heart, you are a girl. So this means in the inside, you insidiously hate your peers for being different than you. And at the same time, ostracization still harms you. Have a seat. But to my constructive material today, my first contention is that children are simply worse off. Have a seat. And secondly, they're coerced into identity. A coerced identity is a legitimate form of happiness. And this is something that the closing government tried to talk about to you today. But firstly, the harms. Parents that are conservative and religious take pride in the fact that their children have gender identities. Have a seat. But when parents can't decide that their children have an identity, they will hate their children even more because they can't fulfill what they think that their children should be. This also means that children are harboring negative emotions when their parents don't like them, when their parents aren't fulfilled. So they feel worse about themselves. Therefore, they're unhappy with the fact that genderlessness are forced upon them. People often look up to their parents. They look up to their mom or their dad. So if they're sexually a girl and their sexual organs are female and they look up to their female mother, they will see their mother probably as a role model. Likewise, they'll just see adults in the streets and want to identify with them. But because they're blocked from that, they're forced into genderlessness, they feel subhuman, less than the adults around them because they can't choose to be like that at all. So this idea of my second contention is that a coerced identity is a legitimate form of happiness. The concept is not neutrality. We've already agreed that being genderlessness will bring you a lot of unhappiness. So to experience all of the harms outlined in my first contention, but even if your parents force a concept of gender on you, this doesn't mean you can't derive happiness from it. Likewise, on this idea of religion, when your parents force religion upon you, you can still champion that for yourself. You can still be a good Christian. The comparative is religion, and I think that I can find happiness in my gender if I want to.
Here. Now I'd like to conclude about this topic.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are imprisoned. From the moment we are born, we are slapped upon the identity that you have to be a male or a female. Side opposition will tell us that social movements are enough and inherently that people still have a choice after that. But they've never understood the moral problem here. That why is it right for people to actually be forced upon such identity before they could even choose, that the state and the government should have such power to force upon such identity? We think that's a question they have to solve and they have never done it. Right? So I'm going to ask 3 questions today. What do we really want today? And I'm going to set you the standards to clarify the entire messy debate. Secondly, what is the best environment for an individual to actualize, and what exactly is consent in today's debate? And thirdly, will such a policy ultimately be harmful at all, which should be integrated all along my clashes, right? On the first question, what exactly do we want? Now, firstly, we do not want a legal identity stamped upon an infant with no volition to choose at all, right? We tell you that, ladies and gentlemen, from birth, we have subjected all people to actually to ensuring them to structural oppression that they have never have a choice out of, right? Ultimately, ladies and gentlemen, these are constructs that they are forcing upon them, that whatever inherent oppressions within these constructs will be absorbed by the child regardless, right? No, thank you. For example, if you're a man, you cannot marry a man. Never mind that you could not choose to be a man. And then opposition will tell you that, no, thank you, man. Opposition will tell you that, oh, well, there are social movements, and these social movements are inherently already enough, right? That's what's going on the entire opposition bench, right? Now, ladies and gentlemen, we do not merely want a quasi-equality, whereby, progressives looks as if people are being more equal, but equality inherently is still defined along the binary of a man and a woman, right? That if you talk about equal wages, we're talking about equal wages between a man and a woman, and not simply between all humans, right? And notice the language that they have been using, right? They are saying that, boys can choose to play with girls' toys, or girls can choose to play with boys' toys. Why can't toys just be toys? That is the world we are talking about, right? They would think that this kind of inherent gender constructs are already oppression in themselves, and that is something that they are putting the child to when they never had a choice in the very first place, right? No, thank you, sit down, right? And that is the problem that they want to actually perpetuate even further, regardless of all the social movements they have been seeing, right? Now, ladies and gentlemen, we tell you ultimately that the very reason why the most radical movements, no thank you, like the non-binary movements and all these kind of movements do not gain traction is because the opposition that justifies such social movements to be sufficient for an individual to achieve the freedom of choice. They still have not proven why a child, can choose their own identity outside of the constructs forced upon them, when from the very moment they're born, they are already cultured into such kind of identities. No, thank you. Right? Ultimately, ladies and gentlemen, the exclusive thing on side government here is this feeling of shame and guilt, which I'll elaborate further on later on in my second clash. No, thank you. Right? This idea of shame and you that in these formative years they are ingrained into psychologically that they have never been able to fall out of, right? We tell you, ladies and gentlemen, side government envisions a world similar to Germany and Sweden, whereby Lego does not allow classifications of male or female zones and toys, and the ads of toys are not exclusively featuring that of males or females within the kind of campaigns, right? That you do not actively socialize children, into such kind of binaries. And the more important thing, ladies and gentlemen, is that legally we are not forcing them a construct from the moment they are born. And we think that is the most important thing that we have to recognize today, right? That ultimately states will have no power over the individual to actualize themselves, that parents will have no power to actually force an individual to actualize over themselves, that society will have no power to force the individual to actualize themselves, right? No, thank you. And that is really the world that we want, right? Ultimately, that legal question is something that side opposition has never been able to deal with, and my member have already talked about that they've never responded at all. No, thank you. But on the second question, right, what is the best environment? And this is where I'll show you why it is not harmful. In fact, it is harmful on their side, right? On the analogy of religion, right, there is a clash that has happened a lot, right? Now, my member already told you that, no, thank you. that a lot of such kind of religions like Christianity and Muslims are basically homogenized, arbitrated religions, right? For example, if I would illustrate, that means that when you're born Christian or born Muslim, you're inherently already formulated into your culture that you should be such kind of things. And that prevents you from associating with other kinds of religions, right? Should you choose to associate with other religions, you will feel guilt. Why? Because you can only associate with other religions from first having related to your prior religion in the very first place. That is how guilt happens, right? That when you're going to associate with something else, you have to first relate to what you already are and what you already have been through before you can associate with something else. And that is the kind of oppression they're putting in, right? So if I put it in the perspective of gender, just because you get to choose a gender out of the binary when you grow up, it doesn't mean you don't get affected or oppressed from all these kind of things that happen, right? And therefore the better environment is pretty clear here, right? That we do not want to inflict shame on the child before they can even have a choice over whether to have this kind of shame at all, right? That is just because, eventually they can have a choice to actually go and choose other forms of identity doesn't mean they don't already have felt the oppression, they aren't already inflicted that harm. That is the explicit harm that will always be inflicted on the child that they have never dealt with. But before my second part, yes.
All this guilt and shame that you speak of in this horrible world that we live in is the world these parents live in and the society around them. Why won't these parents guilt and shame this child every single day until they're 16?
It's not the parents that guilt and shame this child, right? It's the legal structures that are inherent in the very first place, right? That because your passport says you're something, or all these kind of things that you're something, right? But furthermore, ladies and gentlemen, we are telling you about the legal and the social implications of it, right? That ultimately what you're going to have is a child that can say, that I am whatever I want without first having to say that I'm a man or a woman, right? And practically, ladies and gentlemen, what side of opposition wants is that they're okay with the shame in the very first place. The fact they talk about ostracization, right? The language that, because inherently I feel like a girl, that's why I want to relate with such kind of things, shows that ultimately you can only relate to relationships not by affection but rather by gender, and that is the world to support, right? And I'm giving an example. It's basically like a relationship, right? Why is affection determined upon whether you're a boy or a girl, right? We want a world whereby people, are not forcing against each other that you have to act like a boy or act like a girl for me to love you, but rather one that, I love you because I love you. And that's the kind of things that should happen ultimately, right? Rather, we are telling you about the fluidity. What we are giving them is a fluidity. We're not saying that genders cannot exist. If people still choose to identify with genders, we're totally fine with that, right? But the most important thing is that this should not be imposed upon them, and they should not have to first feel the guilt and the shame from having to identify with this kind of things before they can choose other constructs of identity. And we think, therefore, because of the volition of the child is so important that we do not want to hurt them and harm them before they can even choose to fight against such kind of things. We're extremely proud to propose because we don't believe in gender.
Cool. Mr. Speaker, the comparison in this debate is not choice versus a lack of it. The comparison in this debate is an unfulfilling guilt trip your parents will put you through until you're 18 and coerced happiness. We will say on the opposition, we would bite the bullet and say, have your gender roles, force people to buy Barbies, insofar as that protects the child and it puts the child in a position of comfort and happiness. We think that child should be in that position. That's why we think this debate lost a lot of grounds. I'll ask two questions. The first, on which side will people be more happy with their bodies and their identities? And the second question, will children be in a better position on the side of government or on the side of opposition? So we heard it all. The roles are solidified, and as a result, we have associations to gender, to which we will say, you don't change that. We think you can legally and socially construct the world of a child. But let me walk you through a mind of a parent. It doesn't have to be a religious parent, Mr. Speaker. Neither does it have to be a conservative parent. But an average person in a society, in status quo as a parent, feels gender is an important role. Maybe because you're a conservative Christian individual who thinks you must wear a dress to church, or a Muslim mother who believes a daughter must wear a hijab if she wants to be the perfect woman, or a person who believes her daughter should be a cook because that's how women are supposed to be. These parents don't change in your world. You don't change them, for a lack of a better word, because they are bigots. In your world, you would submit a child to this parental household. But on top of that, you wouldn't let that child be a figment of her parents' best identity. That child wouldn't be what the parent thinks is perfect. It would be what the state thinks is perfect. So for that child to live in that world, we say is hell. Every day she believes she's not a woman, not because her parents wouldn't allow it, but because the state is the vilification. Have a seat. In your world, the child won't believe in genderlessness. She will just feel she's not allowed to be a female until 16. In that world, it's a world in which she won't think she can opt out of being a female. She will just feel like she only has to wait till she's 16. And until she's 16, you will make life hell for that person. But the last thing we will say is your gender roles become worse. Because when this person becomes 16 and she's a true Muslim woman or a true Christian person, we think she will never leave the gender role. And in your world, she'll be forced to enforce in her life because 16 years of her life was missing from the gender. We think that is a world in which it is more coercive for people. And when they're 16, they will never opt out of this gender world that you say exists. Have a seat. So we think the comparison in this debate is not children being more gender neutral, it's children feeling more associated with their gender and feeling unhappy until they're 16 because your parents make you feel lesser of a human being every single day. So we think people are not happy in your world. If it means being a woman, buying Barbie dolls, not loving another person, we say, so be it. People are happier that way. The world is constructed in a horrible reality. Second question, have a seat after this. Will children be in a better position to fight their parents? Because when I asked in a POI, do you fix the guilt and the shame? He said, no, we legally and socially construct the world, therefore everything becomes better and you normalize the next generation. So what a load of bull hockey, right? In their world, they will never be able to change the people around them. Why so? So the guilt and shame you say are so important for children to break away will become their everyday life. Every day they are forced to live in a world where their parents think they're going to hell maybe for not being a proper female. Every day this child is forced to feel like the world around them is not constructed for them. Only when they're 16, they can do that. That is a world in which this child will not have a bargaining chip. This child will never feel like she's in a better position to fight their parents. If anything, this child will feel like she's failed her parents. She's not the person she's supposed to be. That child, Mr. Speaker, will be in a position of submission. And that child, we say, will have a horrible relationship with their parent. Which is why we say the comparison is a child with a coerced identity. We say Muslim women every day around this world are coerced into believing that a hijab brings them happiness. It makes them less of a person. I wear makeup. It's not something I decided I wanted to, but it makes me happy. It makes me more of a person than I am today, than I'll ever be. If that journey starts off when they're 16 and it was preceded by 16 years of guilt and shame and worthlessness, the point at which she becomes 16 and she chooses to adopt a gender, she will feel sadder about her life. But on top of that, Mr. Speaker, Sonia told you she will associate genderlessness with unhappiness. That association is the most harmful association you can have because that makes her less accepting of genderlessness. It makes her vilify the state. It makes her believe that the state is the reason for her unhappiness and the discomfort in her life. We say the comfort of your parents as a child is the prerequisite for you being a human being. We think you will not have her engage in school. She will never go to play parks. We say a coerced identity makes a person better. Closing.
Genderlessness does not mean the absence of gender. Just means you won't shame you for a woman one day and not a woman the next day. Feminine the next day, not feminine the next day. Okay? No shaming happens. That's an imaginary argument we're remonting. But anyway, tiger parents exist in your paradigm. You never said how you're gonna stop it. They will exist anyway. At least we have an outlet.
Great. So it's a scale. If tiger parents exist on our side, at least this child is not guilted and shamed and made feel horrible because she's not part of her gender. In our world, this religious, bigoted, tiger parenting will give their child a gender. She'll be a female, she'll opt into all the gender roles, but she'll be loved by her parents. She'll feel comfortable at home. She'll be a person who is deemed as fulfilled. So the comparison is in our world, there'll be less guilting, there'll be less shaming because she fits within that construct. The rebuttal to guilt is that you make it worse, you make it harmful, you make this child believe that every day she's lesser of a human being. But the third question I ask is, who normalizes and changes the world, right? Because it was apparently true on the side of government that social movement isn't enough and that this world, I'm not taking anymore, that this world is constructed horribly, so we cannot wait for organic change. Right, so we will agree that the world is not going to change anytime soon and that gender norms are obviously something that we need to work on. But if you guilt a child into believing that she's genderless and her parents every day tell her that this is not your identity, this is something we have to put up because the state wants us to do this, every day this child is going to believe that the enemy of her life is not her parents, it is the state and its genderlessness. So when this child opts out when she's 16, when this child decides to pick her gender for whatever reason it may be, when she's 16, Mr. Speaker, she's going to associate genderlessness or the lack of picking her gender with unhappiness. And at that point, we will say she will never be able to associate happiness with your model. So in your world, you actually entrench gender roles. Because when she just becomes 16 and she just decides to wear a dress end up cooking because the parents told her every day you should be cooking instead of going to school, that is a child that will indoctrinate her child. That is a child who will never be accepting of gender fluidity. So the comparison at the end of this clash is closing opposition told you that a coerced identity that shapes a child's formative years, as long as it's comfortable, it brings you happiness, and you don't associate genderlessness with sadness and guilt. That is a world in which people are happier. Even if it means people are trapped within this prison, we say if this prison is better than the world that you live in, we think this child is in a better position with 7-5 to do this.
Okay, so all the cross floor shake hands with outside while you
Yeah, we go now.
Thank you, thank you.
Be the best man.